Immigration fight in Washington is heating up. A federal judge says the Trump administration may be in criminal contempt for defying an order to stop deportation flights. NBC's Hallie Jackson has the latest.
An extraordinary escalation this morning between President Trump and the federal courts. The Trump administration appealing overnight after a judge threatened criminal contempt against them, saying officials ignored his order to turn around deportation flights headed to El Salvador last month. Judge James Boasberg writing, "The Constitution does not tolerate willful disobedience of judicial orders." The judge writing, "Contempt proceedings will start if those hundreds of Venezuelan migrants don't get a chance to legally challenge their removal." The clash coming just hours after another federal judge chastised the administration for ignoring a Supreme Court ruling to facilitate the return of a man mistakenly deported to a notorious prison in El Salvador.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Dr. John is back. A federal courtroom is about to face Trump's inner circle. Loyalists who've spent years dodging accountability, treating subpoenas like suggestions and court orders like inconveniences, utterly convinced the rules simply don't apply to them. And then the judge decides to speak. But this isn't the dry procedural drone you expect. There are no velvet gloves, no polite legal tap dancing, no pretty please comply wrapped in Latin. This judge, and I promise you this is straight from the transcript of reality, looks across that courtroom and delivers a verbal hammer blow.
A federal judge says that he has found probable cause to hold Trump administration officials in contempt of court. That came from U.S. District Judge James Boasberg after the U.S. government violated his orders to turn around planes that were carrying migrants who were deported to El Salvador. The administration has used a wartime law to deport people who the administration claims were members of a Venezuelan gang known as Tren de Araguas, deemed a foreign terrorist organization.
The message is ice cold and absolutely unspinnable. The court's reservoir of patience has been completely drained. It is empty. Any future act of defiance, any single step out of line, and the gavel isn't just coming down on the desk, it's coming down on their lives. The direct consequence won't be a fine or a sternly worded letter. It will be the cold steel of a jail cell. Prison, incarceration, for the highest-ranking acolytes in Donald Trump's orbit. Now here is where the theater of political bravado collides headfirst with the immovable wall of reality. These very same figures, the ones you see on cable news every single night, chests puffed out, voices booming, performing this caricature of strength, lecturing America about law and order while kneeling at the altar of absolute power, they crumble, right there, in real time, in the sterile light of the federal courthouse.
Battle between the White House and the courts is heating up. A judge is now threatening to start a contempt investigation over what he calls a willful disregard of his order to halt deportations to El Salvador. ABC's Nicole D'Antonio is in Washington with those details.
This morning, growing concerns surrounding the deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the Maryland husband and father who the administration admits was wrongfully sent to El Salvador. Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen now pushing for Abrego Garcia's release.
And the U.S. courts have found that he was illegally taken from the United States, and the government of El Salvador has no evidence that he was part of MS-13. Why is El Salvador continuing to hold him in CCOT?
A unanimous Supreme Court ordered the administration to let him return to the U.S. for a due process hearing. But the White House insists he will never live in the United States again and is criticizing the senator's visit.
The mask of invincibility shatters. Reports paint a visceral picture. Visible frustration twisting their faces, raw anger boiling over because they've lost control of the room, and in the most striking accounts, actual tears of shock and rage. Tears. This wasn't a quiet resignation. This was an emotional implosion. Because for the first time in an eternity, a human being with actual constitutional authority didn't just disagree with them. This judge told them no. Flat out. Absolutely not, and backed it up with a threat that carries the weight of a prison door slamming shut. What followed this seismic shockwave should have been a media firestorm. If this were a movie, the screen would have cut to breaking news banners, emergency podcasts, and wall-to-wall analysis. Yet if you go looking for the coverage, it's a barren wasteland. A few obscure clips buried in the algorithmic graveyard of YouTube. A scattering of dry text articles hidden behind paywalls. It's almost as if a deliberate fog machine was turned on to obscure the severity of what is happening. Because let's be perfectly clear, this is not just another procedural skirmish in the endless legal saga of the Trump era. This is not a hearing that fizzles into a settlement. This is a raw, unvarnished constitutional showdown. It pits the judiciary against the executive in a cage match for the soul of checks and balances. This judge didn't just draw a line in the sand. They dug a trench, fortified it with concrete, and strung razor wire across it. Legal scholars, the ones who rarely agree on the time of day, are calling this a monumental flex of judicial muscle. One analyst described the atmosphere with words so ominous they send a chill down your spine. We are witnessing a constitutional confrontation unlike any in modern American history. Let that sink in. Not since the last century, not in the turbulent 60s, not during Watergate. Modern American history. This isn't a footnote for a dusty law review. This is textbook material. This is the kind of structural clash that future generations will read about origin stories of how a republic bends or breaks. So, what dark chain of events led us to this boiling point? Why did this specific judge finally snap and issue what observers are calling a shocking ultimatum? To understand that, you have to recognize the game that has been played for months, perhaps years. Trump and his allied apparatus have been conducting an experiment, stress testing the very framework of democratic institutions. They've been stonewalling, dodging, and treating legally binding orders like optional suggestions on a menu. They've launched vicious personal attacks on judges, attacked their families online, painting the entire judicial branch as a corrupt deep state conspiracy designed to hamper the will of the people. The message was crystal clear. Rules are for the little people. And the courts? The courts mostly tried to absorb the punches. They issued warnings. They scheduled more hearings. They bent over backward to appear reasonable, demonstrating a patience that critics labeled as paralyzing timidity. But patience, even institutional patience, is a finite resource. It evaporates. When a federal judge finally leans into the microphone and utters the words, "contempt of court," followed by "arrest," the theater dissolves. This becomes a physical reality. This is the system, battered and bruised, planting its feet and pushing back against a machine that thought it had dismantled resistance entirely. The reaction from the MAGA ecosystem was instantaneous and predictable. Volcanic outrage mixed with theatrical shock. It was a collective gasp of indignation. How dare a single judge dictate terms? How dare the courts enforce the uniform code of law upon the anointed? Don't they know who they are dealing with? That attitude, that smug armor of exceptionalism, just slammed directly into a brick wall of judicial resolve. Now, before we peel back the layers of that explosive moment inside the courtroom, before we dissect exactly which actions pushed this judge over the cliff's edge, we need to understand the context. This did not emerge from a vacuum. It was engineered. It's the boiling point of a long, simmering strategy. Since the opening moments of this administration, the movement has waged an all-out asymmetric war on the judiciary. Trump has branded judges as corrupt lunatics, accused them of treasonous bias, and mobilized a digital army of supporters to besiege them online. This has created a dystopian reality where federal judges, people who for centuries have existed in a protective bubble of respect, shielded from the mob, are now receiving death threats. Real, detailed, terrifying threats against their lives and families. A deep dive by public radio documented this nightmare last summer. Federal judges have been forced to step out of the shadows of their chambers and speak publicly about the climate of fear. They detailed the threats that flood their inboxes simply because they made a ruling that a certain movement didn't like. Imagine that. A tenured judge, appointed for life specifically to be free from political pressure, having to install a panic room in their house because the rhetoric from the highest office in the land convinced certain people that the judge is a traitor. This is not a bug in a functioning system. This is a catastrophic failure of norms. And this courtroom breakdown, this epic meltdown where the foot soldiers of the movement finally smelled the concrete of a jail cell. This is what happens when the judiciary decides it wants to survive. This is the body's immune system activating against a virus. So strap in. What we are about to dissect is greater than a single docket number or a one-day media cycle. This is a struggle for the monopoly of power, the definition of accountability, and the terrifying question of whether anyone wearing the Trump brand of protection is actually subject to the universal law. Watching these figures squirm, watching the sweat bead on their brows as the realization dawns that they might actually be the ones paying the price is a deeply conflicting cocktail. It's viscerally satisfying because a nation starved of accountability craves the sight of consequence. But it's equally terrifying because it signals how dangerously close we are to the complete evaporation of institutional order. How did we arrive at this precipice? How is it possible that in the United States, a federal judge must threaten the president's cabinet with a holding cell simply to extract basic legal compliance? How did defying the rule of law become a heroic badge of honor, a rallying cry, rather than a mark of shame? These are the haunting questions that demand an answer. And the answers are infuriating because this tragedy was assembled brick by deliberate brick. We are now standing in the debris, squinting into the chaos, wondering if the structural damage is terminal. Let's dissect it. To truly grasp the volcanic drama of that courtroom outburst, to sense the terror that flickered in their eyes, we have to zoom out to the panoramic view. This moment is a culmination. The current era of Trump's political dominance has been defined by entropy, a deliberate chaos machine aimed at clogging the gears of governance. And the primary punching bag for this chaos has been the courts. Trump and his confidants have broadcast a singular, unmistakable message. The judiciary is not a peer. It is not a check. It is an illegitimate nuisance to be bulldozed. I'm not dealing in hyperbole. A collective digital archive now tracks this phenomenon, cataloging the assault on legal institutions and the intimidation of witnesses. It's a living document of how a political machine systematically deconstructs accountability. So when this judge issued that final warning, when they declared from the bench that absolutism meets a boundary, they weren't just adjudicating a narrow motion. They were punching a hole in the balloon of impunity. They were erecting a dam against a flood of violent rhetoric that has been crashing down on the legal system for months. It was a counteroffensive against the idea that a court order is merely a suggestion and that a subpoena is just an invitation to a debate. Here's the behavioral pattern the judge had observed. Trump officials would be summoned. They would no-show, or they would show up but lock their jaws, pretending memory loss or invoking privileges that would be laughed out of a first-year law class. When the court pushed back with a gentle nudge, Trump's digital war room lit the fuse. They'd blast the judge's name on social media, turning them into a trending villain. They'd scream witch hunt and rigged system until the signal of justice was lost in the noise of rage. This strategy is called flooding the zone. Make it so toxic, so chaotic, that the system collapses under its own weight. And for a worrying stretch of time, the delay tactic worked because judges are cautious by nature. They know that throwing a cabinet secretary in a cell is a one-way trip to an escalation ladder. So they cajoled, they fined, they tolerated. But every well has a bottom. Every human being, even one in a robe, has a tripwire. And on that day in court, the wire snapped. The final notice was deployed without ambiguity. The court's patience has evaporated. The next infraction means incarceration. That is not legal jargon. That's a blunt instrument of state power being aimed directly at the defendant's freedom. And the reaction from the MAGA hierarchy in that room was a visceral psychological break. They lost their composure because their internal calculus never factored this in. Their model of reality was faulty. They assumed permanent protection. They assumed that raw political clout was a get-out-of-jail-free card. They miscalculated catastrophically. Who was actually squirming on those hard wooden benches? The records point to high-level apparatchiks, cabinet-adjacent power players, the muscle and brains of the MAGA operation. We aren't talking about volunteer rally attendees or low-level staff taking the fall. These are the architects. These are the decision makers. And witnessing these titans of bravado collapse into a puddle of anxiety is deeply instructive. It reveals that the tough guy aesthetic sold on television is a performance sustained only by the absence of resistance. Confronted with the concrete reality of contempt and arrest, all that bluster evaporated like steam. Suddenly, the fight against the deep state didn't feel like a grift. It felt like a liability that might cost them years of their life. But this is the fascinating web. This bench slap is happening precisely as the broader strategy of the administration hits a gravity field of resistance everywhere. Congress is showing flickers of independence, refusing to greenlight every wish. State-level governments are walling off their jurisdictions from federal overreach. The military brass has signaled through back channels its discomfort with extreme ideological meddling. And finally, the judiciary is setting a hard perimeter. Legal analysts aren't being dramatic when they call this a constitutional confrontation. This is a gauge test. Can the executive simply ignore the judicial? Can officials attack judges and walk away with no scars? Are they truly unfettered? The answer booming back from the court is unequivocal. No, you are not gods. And that answer is about to be tested under fire, because Trump isn't wired to back down. Retreat is a sin in the doctrine of the movement. His entire political persona is forged from the fire of defiance. When a judge threatens his loyalists with the slammer, Trump's reaction isn't, okay, let's comply. It's an escalation. It's a furious tirade at a rally, it's a social media meltdown branding the judge a radical leftist operative, and it's a fundraising blast that frames the constitutional process as a deep state coup. The base absorbs this, they metabolize it. They see the judge's boldness not as bravery, but as proof that the swamp is panicking. They open their wallets. The emotional pitch of "they're coming for you by coming for him" intensifies. But this time, a variable has changed. The judge isn't folding. The robe is not afraid of the tweet. The judiciary is signaling a new doctrine. We are immune to your digital mobs. Your political power stops at the courthouse steps. So, what is the next move in this high-stakes chess game? Do the MAGA lieutenants swallow their pride and start answering questions? Do they show up towing the line, humiliated but free? Or do they call the judge's bluff, daring the bailiffs to snap the cuffs on? Smart money says they test the bounds. They push a toe over the line to prove the line is an illusion. And then the gavel comes down. Someone gets held in contempt. The reality of orange jumpsuits enters the legal calculus. That's when the true constitutional crisis detonates, because Trump won't let his soldiers rot. He will wave the pardon pen. Can a president erase a contempt charge? Is criminal judicial enforcement untouchable by the executive clemency power? What happens if the judge shrugs and says, "I don't recognize your pardon because the crime is against the court's authority, not the federal penal code"? That's the edge of the map where the legal dragons live. And all of this detonates right in the path of the incoming electoral cycle. The midterms are a shadow looming over every motion filed. Trump and his strategists know these legal fireworks are spectacle. They know swing voters are watching. They are calculating that a narrative of victimhood, the corrupt courts are locking up patriots, will animate their base. But the counter-narrative is powerful. They are melting down because they might actually face a consequence. That sticks in the mind. MAGA officials, who sold their brand as unbreakable alpha warriors, weeping and trembling in court. That image is an acid that corrodes the myth of strength. The cult of personality relies on the illusion of winning. If the courts make them look like scared defendants, the sheen wears off with the moderate voters they desperately need. Let's zoom in on the optical warfare of this. You have these officials who've built a cottage industry out of calling others snowflakes. They mock liberal tears. They preach a gospel of unapologetic toughness. And yet, under the fluorescent lights of a federal courtroom, facing a judge who holds their liberty in a quill pen, they break. They seethe, they cry, they object, but they cannot hide the fear. That's a branding disaster. Trump's entire machine is built on the premise of unstoppable forward motion. A meltdown is a pause, it's a crack in the engine block. Some loyalists will frame this as noble suffering. But others, the ones who vote on strength, not drama, might start asking, why are the untouchables so scared of a room with no cameras if they are truly righteous? Doubt is a silent killer of authoritarian movements. Here is the core schema you must internalize to navigate the noise. First, the timeline of arrogance. Trump's network treated the judicial branch like a punching bag, ignoring its mandates with a smirk, launching ad hominem attacks on judges, and weaponizing social media to threaten them. They assumed legal gravity didn't apply to their mass. For a stretch, they floated above it all because the courts hesitated to escalate. But the fuse burned down. The judge looked at the record of stonewalling and decided the time for negotiation was over. Compliance is no longer a request. It's a demand with handcuffs attached. Second, the human collapse. The targets in that courtroom weren't rookies. They were seasoned media operators who know how to control a narrative. But the body betrays us under extreme stress. The frustration, the visible anger, the reports of actual tears. This was the psyche rebelling against an unthinkable outcome. They never planned for losing. They never budgeted for the possibility that the law is, in fact, a tangible force. Their emotional implosion is the central alibi of the system's power. It says, no matter how high you climb, a judge can still make you feel small. Third, recognize the ecosystem. This isn't a lone case. It's a symptom of a broader scorched earth campaign against civil society. Judges have had to endure a radical shift in their security profile. Death threats are now occupational hazards. A ruling against a Trump policy doesn't just mean an appeal, it means a SWAT team called to your house. This terrorism of the robe is designed to create a chilling effect, to make judges second-guess ruling against power. But by pushing too far, they triggered an autoimmune response. The court is fighting back not for policy, but for survival. Fourth, the precipice we stand on. We are speedrunning a constitutional crisis. When senior government officials operate on the assumption they can mute the judiciary, and the judiciary responds by reaching for the keys to the jail, the friction sends sparks into the dry tinder of the body politic. The Constitution sketches a beautiful dance of mutual constraint. Trump's philosophy rejects the dance entirely. He wants a solo performance. This courtroom moment is the band striking up the music anyway, forcing him to follow the choreography or acknowledge the coup. The judiciary is declaring that the Article 3 branch will not be erased by Article 2. This is the hour of decision. Why does this land on your doorstep? Why should the lives of everyday people be disrupted by the anxiety of a political elite in a courtroom? Because the alternative is a blank check for tyranny. If the people at the peak of power can treat a court order like a spam call, then the social contract is void. What is the point of a speed limit? What is the point of a contract? The reason you don't live in a Hobbesian state of nature is that we agreed on neutral arbiters. If the boss class opts out, the entire machinery of justice becomes a placebo. It affects your life whether you watch the news or not, because it rewrites the terms of citizenship. If they are above the law doesn't exist. So yes, the courtroom breakdown, the judge's final warning, it's a high-stakes drama, but it's not entertainment. It's the soul of the republic on a stainless steel operating table. The uncomfortable truth is that we may be past the phase of de-escalation. Trump won't wake up tomorrow with a sudden reverence for gavels and statutes. His movement's DNA rejects it. They view the judiciary not as a branch, but as a hostile faction. So when the judge says, comply or go to jail, the playbook says to scream martyrdom. Chuck the compliance, take the contempt, and let the base boil over. This drags us into the gray zones of executive power. The president encouraging defiance of contempt orders, pardoning people for defying the very courts that sustain his oath. It's a feedback loop of disintegration. The coming electoral battle will be lit by the glow of this constitutional fire. Voters will be asked to stand for or against the principle of accountability. Trump's wager is that his narrative of persecution will glue his coalition together tighter than ever. He bets that they will see the tears in court as the precious suffering of patriots. But there's a danger in that bet. Most people, even those who distrust Washington, don't actually trust politicians who sob when they're told to follow the rules. It looks weak. It looks guilty. Maybe this moment, this vivid snapshot of power being terrified, awakens a sleeping consciousness. Maybe it reminds a fractured populace that the judge in the black robe isn't some swamp monster, but a necessary circuit breaker against absolutism. Or maybe the tribal lines are too deep. Maybe we simply scroll past the meltdown like everything else. But the judge didn't leave it up to the scroll. The judge threw down the gauntlet. A solitary figure in a black robe just became the living symbol of friction against the unipartisan power grab. Symbols matter. They redirect the current of history. Trump knows the symbolic power of a judge. That's why he has spent so much energy trying to strip them of their dignity, to brand them as corrupt costumes rather than seats of honor. If the public respects the robe, the president is limited. If the public views the judge as just another partisan influencer, then the last barrier to the flood is gone. This showdown distills that entire conflict into a single frame: the law versus the man. My bet? The judge doesn't blink. This isn't a career politician trembling over a primary challenge. This is a lifetime appointee who has seen bullies come and go. They are built with steel spines. But Trump is not a bully to be dismissed. He is a systemic force, a human earthquake. So this collision is new territory, an unmapped legal continent. We truly don't know if our institutions are built to withstand this kind of sustained pressure. The emotional breaking of the MAGA leaders in that sterile room. That image is sticky. It will tattoo itself onto the collective memory. It contradicts the very essence of the Trumpian sales pitch. That moment of psychological fracture, the dawning horror that they aren't gods, just potential inmates, is the truth the propaganda machine works overtime to hide. Yet the truth has a leaking problem. It seeps through the cracks. The judge's gauntlet is on the floor. The challenge is official. Now we wait to see who has the nerve to pick it up. My instinct says escalation is inevitable because surrender is not an option in this story. And that, right there, is why the textbooks of the future are writing themselves right now.